Well, hello, everybody, and thank you, all of you, so much for coming along. Very special evening this evening, in conversation live here at the RSM, and we have a very special guest, Paul Johnson from the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Not quite as ancient as the Royal Society of Medicine, as I was saying. And the reason that we've got Paul here this evening was that I managed to nobble him in the lobby of the RSM. I was walking through the RSM, having had a meeting here, and I bumped into this very recognizable face, but I wasn't quite sure who it was. So I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm Paul Johnson." I said, "Oh, I saw you on Newsnight last night." And I told him that we've been running for a couple of years now, these In Conversation Live, and very kindly he agreed to come and join us here. So he's director of the IFS since 2011, visiting professor at UCL, and he's actually an honorary doctor at York University. I saw a picture of him wearing a funny hat last week there, so congratulations for that. Awarded a CBE in 2018. Wow. And had spells at the Treasury, Department of Education, and FSA, Financial Services Authority, yeah. John Tyner was in charge of it. Do you remember John Tyner?
It was Howard Davis when I was there.
Oh, Howard, yeah, but his predecessor, I think. Member of the Committee for Climate Change, we might get onto the green agenda, and really relevant for this evening is member of the Times Health Commission. And Paul wanted me to say this is a private meeting, so we might meander into politics quite a bit, actually, but I hope. But it's a private meeting, so we don't want anybody to report what it goes on here, because we want to get to the bottom of things. So please be discreet in mentioning what we're talking about this evening. So Paul, tell us a little bit about you, for starters. We always start off with I said it's a bit like Desert Island Disc without the music, but a little bit about you. You went to Oxford University, PPE, got a first, if I remember, is that right? And then Birkbeck University after that. Tell us a bit about your background.
Yeah, I did PPE at Oxford. By mistake, really, as a kid, I was just terribly interested in politics, and I applied to all sorts of places to do politics, and Oxford to do this PPE thing, which I didn't know very much about. Got in somehow, and then dropped politics almost immediately because it was so boring as an academic subject, and focused on economics with a little bit of philosophy. I was actually tutorial partner to Ed Balls for most of the time I was there, so that was quite hard work, frankly. Because I focused on economics, then actually my first job was at the IFS, and while I was there, I'd say to people that two times in my life I'd be most tired. One was when I had 4 children under the age of 5, and the other was when I was doing a part-time degree at Birkbeck in the evenings whilst working full-time, and that was really hard work.
And tell us a bit about the IFS, because we're medics rather than economists, a little bit of the background of that, and you've been director since 2011, yeah?
Yeah, so the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, it is a research institute. We're sometimes called a think tank. We like to think of ourselves as a research institute. We focus on economics of public policy, essentially. So public finances, and then the economics of tax, welfare, pensions, education, health, labour markets, and inequality are the biggest chunk of what we do. We are very much independent, so we are not political in either direction, and very, very focused on maintaining our independence. I think we're pretty unusual in the sense that you might see some of the public facing work that we do. So we are engaged in the public debate on all of the things that I've just described, do a lot of work around fiscal events and budgets, but most of my colleagues spend most of their time doing really quite serious academic work. So if we were a university economics department, we'd be in the top 3 or 4 in the country. And actually most of our funding comes to do academic research from the research councils and big charitable foundations, so that we're a combination, I think quite a unique one, of this very sort of serious academic empirical research. All of what we do is based on analysing very, very large data sets and applying statistical techniques to it. And then I'm sort of the froth on the top, trying to communicate some of that to the wider world.
You're the ambassador, you're a fundraiser as well. Do you have to do, or are you financially secure?
We have no money, so if anyone would like to donate,
join the club.
We don't have a building like this. I've got no sympathy. We are in very cheap and shabby rented offices just the other side of Tottenham Court Road. Because most of the funding is from applying to do big research projects. The key fundraisers are actually my colleagues who are leading the work on education, or leading the work on tax, or leading the work on whatever. And we work very closely with senior academics, particularly at UCL. So most of the money comes in through the very long and detailed research proposals they'll write, send off to the research councils, wait a year, literally, to find out whether they're funded or not after they've gone through the refereeing process. So I clearly help with a lot of that. And then we do have a membership and a corporate membership program. And I sometimes, I know you're not paying me, but I do sometimes go out and sing for my supper, and people will pay to be members of the IFS for that kind of thing.
You write extremely nice articles in the Times. I've been reading them in advance of this discussion. But by the way, this is the idea tonight. Is normally it's a conversation is like Desert Island Disc without the music. Tonight I thought it might be more like BBC question time. So
please be better behaved.
Yeah. When I said that to Paul, he said surely not that level. So we're upgraded BBC question time. So please do join in and ask some questions. So Paul, I thought it might be interesting to get your perspective on kind of how we got to where we are now. Clearly, we've got big problems right now. I think you said that we've shot ourselves in the foot with the mini budget and with Brexit and with a few other things as well, no doubt. And of course, the economy has huge impact on the NHS going forward. And in fact, actually, Jill, our dean here, and I were talking about the RSM coming up with some ideas for the future of the NHS, rather than leaving it just to the Times newspaper to do it. Although it's a very important newspaper, of course. So please join in. But in terms of how we got to where we are now, let's sort of romp through the economy, going right back to John Major. I remember, the end of the John Major's government and the sleaze and the back to basics. It's kind of almost become full cycle, because there's quite a bit of sleaze and back to basics
indeed
now. So, I mean, what went wrong at the end of the Major government? They sort of ran out of steam, rather like the Conservatives now, do you think? Or
well, like they did obviously in '92, so there's only won a pretty small majority, and it had a lot of trouble, as has been true in the party for a long time, with the sort of Eurosceptics, and that caused John Major, of course, a lot of trouble. And the big economic shock to them was coming out of the European exchange rate mechanism and the very brief spike of interest rates at 15%, I think only for about a day. But the
Norman Lamont singing in his bar.
Absolutely. I shouldn't have regret Rianne. There we are. That's a Desert Island Disc, isn't it?
Yeah.
The problem having been we went into the European exchange rate mechanism, which, if you recall, was something that meant the pound had to be within a limited range against the other European currencies at a relatively high rate, and then the markets decided it was a one-way bet to bet against the pound, and they were right. It wasn't possible to maintain it at that level. Came out, the pound became less valuable, so that lost the Conservatives their reputation for economic credibility, and on top of that, immediately after the 1992 election, just before the 1992 election, we had a tax cutting budget as a way of trying to win the election, which worked. And immediately afterwards, we had a tax raising budget, including proposition to put VAT at the full rate on domestic energy. And that resulted in Norman Lamont getting the sack and being replaced by Kenneth Clarke. So if you read Norman Lamont's memoirs, he says that the pre-1992 election budget was his best from a political point of view, but his worst economically, whereas his post-92 budget was his best economically, but the worst politically, which I think probably illustrates really rather well the problems of running an effective economic policy. Indeed, if you look over time, it is remarkable. If you look at budgets every year since about 1974, and all of the big tax raising budgets are just after an election, and all the big tax cutting budgets are just before an election, probably as you'd expect. But we went through the 1990s. I mean, actually, and I think the big difference between now and say 1995, 1996, just before that election then, is the Conservatives then did run a pretty tight fiscal and economic ship. So the economy was recovering from the early 90s recession. There was a pretty hard grip, I mean, a very hard grip on public spending at that time. And when Labour won the 1997 election, the economy was doing pretty well and the public finances were in pretty good shape.
And there was growth during those years, wasn't there? I was looking at one of your graphs on your website, and the 90s, there was quite a bit of economic growth in GDP.
The economy was growing quite well in the 90s. I mean, the one big, well, there were lots of issues, of course, there. I mean, the one big gap there was that in public sector investment went down to almost nil. I mean, it really was extraordinary. So one of the ways that the Conservatives in the 90s kept control on the public finances was just to really push public sector investment down. Interesting, actually, at the moment, public sector investment is actually very high by UK historic standards, outside of the period when we were spending lots of money on housing and nationalised industries. It's probably at its highest level ever. And it was its lowest level ever in the late 1990s. So that was one big difference. But the other difference, as you say, we had growth. People's incomes were rising over the 1990s, and the inheritance of the Labour Party in 1997 from a public finance point of view was pretty strong. From the economy had been growing for a while, and clearly, you know, the difference today, a huge difference today, is the economy's not being, I mean, the economy is still smaller than it was pre-COVID, only major country where that's true. And we've had very, very little income growth for the last 15 years, probably the lowest we've had since the Industrial Revolution, which is an extraordinary kind of statistic. But that's an illustration, I think, of why things feel so hard today.
And then the Blair years, I remember I interviewed Andrew Dillon, and he described the Blair years as kind of golden years. Maybe he was talking about social investment in social care. But when I again looked at your graphs, there wasn't that much growth during the first 10 years of this century.
Well, there was so as I say, I think New Labour inherited quite a positive situation. The economy was growing pretty well, actually through to about 2005. So that provided additional revenues. I mean, Labour in 97 promised to keep to the Conservative spending plans for the first 2 years as part of their sort of process of proving their fiscal credibility. And actually, they broadly kept to that. And it's interesting, Kenneth Clarke later said that there's no way that the Conservatives would have kept to them because they were so tight. Now, I don't know whether it was just kind of trolling Blair, but it was a sort of, and actually, if you read Blair's memoirs, he's think that was what was his biggest error. It was doing very little in those first 2 years. He sees that as a bit of a wasted time because he didn't both didn't do a great deal in terms of the additional spending, but also didn't get into his stride on public service reform, which was very much the focus of his second and well, particularly a second term, and to some extent.
So that was the education plus spending on the health service.
There's a combination of we had spending on public services and particularly through Gordon Brown's focus, welfare rising quite quickly after 1999. Very big increases in health spending after 2001, after Blair went on Breakfast with Frost, and so we get health spending up to the European average, to which apparently Blair went round to number 10 and yelled, "You stole my fucking budget." That was his response. But then Brown sort of took ownership of that through through big review.
Mm-hmm.
And he sort of owned that increase and took some benefit from finding the money. But yes, there was a lot of extra money for health, and actually for most public services over that period, largely made possible by the fact the economy was growing, but also through some tax increases. So taxes rose gradually, but not dramatically, as a fraction of national income over that period. One of the things that, interestingly, Gordon Brown was never willing to admit to, even though you could just see it in the sort of budget red book. So you had this kind of quite nice combination of the economy growing pretty strongly, people's incomes until about 2005, 2006. So incomes were growing quite well till then, and they stopped about that time, which some people didn't notice at the time. But if you look back at the history of it, it wasn't 2008, the point of the financial crisis, when income stopped growing. It was a couple of years. It was a couple of years before that. But you got these the increase in spending, but also we got sort of reform. So had independent treatment centres in health, and movement to hospital trusts and so on. You got expansion of higher education, tuition loans. You got academies and so on in schools. So you got quite a lot of public sector reform at the. I mean, arguably, you could have done a lot more when you had all of that money. At the same time as putting this additional money in, and particularly in health, you see by 2007, 2008, you really start to see waiting times coming down, and all of the targets being met, or being much closer to being met than was the case. I mean, remember, we worry about waiting times now. I mean, back in '97, I mean, like the Citizens Charter was to reduce waiting times to 18 months, and now we're aiming 18 weeks. So there's sort of things have got better over that time.
Yeah, well, certainly morale was at St George's doing urology then, and morale was much higher than it is now. But Tony Blair's years, I mean, what mistakes do you, looking back, what mistakes do you think they made? The Iraq War must have cost a fortune. That was a bit of a faux pas, especially with the dodgy dossier and so on and so forth. And then the financial crisis, which probably wasn't their fault. Was that purely imported from America?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, the financial crisis essentially resulted from the mortgage market in the United States going belly up, and the way that mortgage has been made available on absurd terms to people who should never have had them, but then sort of sold on through the financial system in ways that a lot of the people buying them didn't really understand. And then, of course, the financial sector is so interrelated that once one thing starts to go wrong, then the whole house of cards starts to come down. Now, I think there was a slightly naive belief in New Labour in the fact that the sort of market would work. And actually, in financial services, there are so many market failures. Not least that the big banks know that they're always going to be bailed out if something goes wrong, but also the lack of information and the capacity to cream off what we call economic rents. All of our money that goes into pensions and so on, you pay a 1% service charge on many trillions of pounds in the economy, and that's quite a lot of money for people that's in the city working in their large towers. So there's lots of fundamental market failures actually in the way that some of that works. That I think there was a failure to understand some of those market failures and the need therefore for some regulation. All of that said, this did absolutely originate in the US mortgage market.
Mm-hmm. And that sort of did for Labour and Gordon Brown, didn't it? Then that led us on to the coalition and Nick Clegg and Cameron and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it was clearly. That was clearly part of it. I mean, it's quite hard to win an election when you've just had a big financial crisis. I think to be fair to Gordon Brown, it was also, to be fair or unfair, depends how you want to look at it. In a sense, it was the only way that he was able to show his skills as Prime Minister. I mean, actually put Gordon Brown in number 10 without a crisis, and he hadn't got a clue because it was sort of didn't know where to look and was focused on so many detailed things and not able to sit back and say these were his priorities, give him a crisis, and actually was extremely effective in that. So in some ways, it almost rescued his reputation as a prime minister rather than the reverse. But clearly, it left us in this very sort of deep recession in 2010 when the election came along. And the Conservatives spent a lot of time saying it was Labour that had bankrupted the country. That was the reason we had this massive deficit and so on. Now, that's clearly not true. I mean, the reason we had a massive deficit was because we'd had a financial crisis, which was worldwide, born in America, and hit the UK hard because we've got a very big financial sector. And so it was bound to hit the UK relatively hard. So I think it's pretty hard to lay much of the blame of that at the door of the Labour government. But I think George Osborne and co were very successful at doing that. And again, George Osborne, writing more honestly now, says, yes, of course it wasn't true what we were saying about the deficit being the fault of Labour. But it worked as a political attack line because people see there's a Labour government and there's an enormous deficit. 1 + 2 = 4.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose that was the trigger for the austerity that we've had for the last 10 years, and maybe I'm going to get it for the next 10 years by the look of it. I mean, was that a mistake? People are saying now that the austerity, there was too much austerity. The Conservatives under Cameron and beyond him, they took too much money out of the economy. What would you say?
Well, there's a huge amount of things going on in the early 2010s. I mean, the first thing to say is in the first 5 years, we were not unusual in European standards. You go to Ireland, I mean, they don't think we had austerity at all. I mean, they cut public sector wages by 20% and, had proper austerity. So, where people say, the UK got it wrong with austerity, they do need to put that in the context of what happened in other European countries, and we were not particularly unusual in that. And we did, in the sense, it's one of the problems we face now, as we faced in 2010, we just became poorer. And it's quite difficult to adjust to becoming poorer. I do think that there were mistakes made, though. I mean, I think first, there was, as happened in the 1990s, there was a big cut in investment spending. And I'm sure saw that in the health sector. And I know that just doesn't make sense as part of a long-term strategy. Second, whatever you thought the appropriate level of borrowing was, you didn't have to get there entirely by cutting spending. It was an 80% spending cuts, 20% tax rises balance, or might even be more than 80% by the end. I think it was a pretty strong case for rebalancing that, a bit less spending cuts and a bit more tax rises. And then I think the third misjudgment, actually, and I think it's become clearer and clearer over time, is that the need to keep borrowing down quite as low as it was kept down, I think certainly ex post doesn't look as necessary as it certainly appeared to some at the time. All countries have borrowed a lot. Debt has risen everywhere, and at least until now, interest rates stayed extremely low. So that was actually a time when you could have you could have borrowed more to protect some of the public services. I think on the other side, people were scared. I mean, Greece and Ireland had the IMF in. Interest rates looked like they might rise at one point. We'd never experienced anything quite like this before. And, there was a lot of money sloshing around in the public sector. I mean, I have had senior leaders in the public sector around that time telling me that, quotes, they were pissing money against the wall. I mean, there was a lot of money around, and there was scope for some consolidation. My view is that the real problem started post about 2014, 2015. So there was scope for consolidation in those first 3 or 4 years. You look at the justice system, you look at the prison system, you look at the social care system, they really started to crumble sort of after about 3 or 4 years of this. And we've really been paying in those sectors the costs of that ever since. I mean, we've been we sacked lots of experienced prison officers, and then we've been looking at the consequences of that. The social care funding has had to be topped up in an emergency fashion pretty much every year since 2015. So we've had very clear consequences, and I think unacceptable consequences actually of some of the scales of those.
£10 billion worth of repairs needed in the NHS, for example, including roofs that are about to crumble. scarily enough. But somehow during those years of the sort of teens of this century, that there was a sort of public consensus that we were heading in the right direction. What we're dealing with now is this feeling that people seem so unhappy. I mean, not just in the health service, but the strikes in so many sectors.
Yeah.
Now, people are sort of in a way that I haven't seen before. Just sticking with the teens for the moment. Do you think that was the case, that people accepted that austerity was inevitable, that it was following on from the financial crisis, so people were more accepting of it?
I think for a period, yes. I mean, it was actually politically popular. If you remember the 2015 election, the Conservatives went into that promising more austerity, and in particular with a promise to cut benefit spending by £12 billion over 3 years. Now, I'm on record as saying that wasn't possible. You couldn't cut benefit spending by 12 billion over 3 years. I was sort of precisely right, but totally wrong, because they did it over 5 years, but they did cut 12 billion from the welfare budget, partly by freezing all working age benefits for 4 years, partly by cutting benefits to families with large numbers of children, partly by pushing the housing benefit bill down, and so on. But that was an election. That was a popular election manifesto to cut 12 billion off the welfare budget at that point. It was front and center. So there was quite a lot of public support for that at the time, but there's clearly much less support for that now. I mean, for me, and this is an economic point, not a political point. The tragedy, in a sense, was the Brexit vote in 2016. Actually, if you look at the economic data, things were just picking up. At that point, earnings were beginning to grow in real terms for over the couple of years before that. The economy was just beginning to pick up, but people weren't quite feeling it yet. There were lots of people who were feeling the consequences of austerity, and of course all of the politics that went around it. And post that vote, you immediately see real incomes drop back again as inflation spiked, as the exchange rate dropped, and it's never recovered from that. And you then see a drop in international investment, inward investment into the UK. And then, of course, you've got we've now had 7 years of political instability. And one of the things that economists, I think, don't talk about anywhere near enough is the economic cost of political instability. I mean, having a politically stable nation is not sufficient for a successful economy. It's pretty important for one. I mean, the US is a sort of an outlier on that, but there is a reason that Italy has been the worst growing economy for the last 30 years, and it is very much related to its very unstable politics. And there is a reason that we've been the worst growing economy for the last 7 or 8 years, and it's very much related to our unstable politics, as well as the economic consequences of Brexit. I mean, who is going to invest in the UK when you get 3 prime ministers, 5 chancellors, and thousands of cabinet ministers in a couple of months? It's very damaging. And
let's do an audience survey. Hands up those people, and then we'll go to Jill. Hands up those people who, like me, think Brexit was a major disaster. Right. We haven't got any Brexiteers in the audience, Paul. So, Jill. Can I have you need a mic, otherwise we won't be on the recording. Thanks, Angelos.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm Gillian Lang, the Dean. The cost of healthcare in the UK has gone up quite dramatically since the NHS started, but we do an awful lot more, and we ought to remember what we do more. We do things like joint replacements, organ transplants, dialysis, modern cancer drugs, targeted treatments, etc. So we do an awful lot more. But my question is, what about the future? Do we stick with a largely taxation-based funding system? Do we have, alongside that, insurance models? Do we have employer-based insurance models? And does it matter as long as we have universal coverage?
That's quite a big question.
Good.
I mean, I think it's important to be clear. The UK is not unusual in the amount we spend on health, having risen very dramatically, over every decade over the last 70 years. We spend about an average amount by OECD standards on healthcare. Every country is seeing it grow, and every country is seeing it grow as a fraction of total spending. But just to give a sort of sense of scale, spending as a fraction of national income has gone up by about 3 times since the NHS was founded. In real terms, it's obviously gone up many times. Since the year 2000, health spending as a fraction of public service spending has risen from about 20% to over 40%. So it's a huge part of what the state does now. I mean, much more than it's ever been in the past, and that reflects exactly what you describe. I mean, the costs have risen, capacity to do things has increased, and it's the one bit of the economy where improved technology doesn't help costs, because if you're better at making people well, then they get ill again later. And, that's not like any other part of the economy. If you get good at doing something, it's done. The trouble with making people better is the buggers come back later. So there's a sort of fundamental, there is a serious issue in there. I mean, there's two. I mean, there's one big long-term question, which is at what point does that stop? Because some economists have done some sort of half joking stuff, which says if healthcare spending rises at its current rate for the next 150 years, it will take 100% of the economy. It presumably needs to stop before it takes 100% of the economy, but it might take a very large part of it, because it is the most important thing to us. As we get richer, we're obviously going to want to spend more on healthcare, we'll want to live a healthy life. So I think it's not unreasonable to think we will spend more on healthcare over time. I think part of the difficulty is the politics is getting politicians to accept that, and particularly to accept that in a world where that will mean higher taxes. So one of the extraordinary tricks we played up until now is that we've had this massive increase in healthcare spending without any increase in taxes. So taxes as a fraction of national income a couple of years ago were basically the same as they were in 1970 and in 1950. And we've done that by abolishing defense spending and abolishing nationalized industries and abolishing housing spending and stopping higher education public spending, and then having a decade of austerity for everything else. So, but that's come to an end, and tax as a fraction of national income is going to rise to record levels in the next couple of years.
What is it, about 33%?
Well, it has been 33% for a very long time. It's due to hit 37% in 2 or 3 years. So a big, sharp increase, partly reflecting the need to spend more on health, partly reflecting, of course, very poor economic growth, partly reflecting very high levels of debt interest spending. So you've got all of that together. So what does that mean for the future? Well, I don't personally think there's a lot to be gained by saying, let's take our current tax-funded model, throw it up in the air and kind of move to some kind of insurance-funded model. In the end, it's rather the same. I mean, you can look at many of the European systems and you count them as social insurance funded or insurance funded, but they're basically taxpayer funded free at the point of use, or broadly speaking. What I don't know, because I'm not an expert in sort of, managing multi-billion-pound organizations, what are the set of changes to the way that we run it which would make it more effective? I think one of the things that you clearly need is more certainty about how that money is going to be available over time. But there are clearly all sorts of problems around the way that it's run, but I don't think they're associated with the fact that it's taxpayer funded. It might be associated with the fact that it's so that it's a single massive organization, which we try and pretend that NHS England runs the whole thing. Now that's just not feasible in some sense, and a lot of countries have more a less integrated system. Now there are potential benefits from a more integrated system, but it's not obvious to me that we reap most of those benefits.
I think we better finish there. So a round of applause for our